you managed to grab a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, you're feeling refreshed. And welcome to those that are joining us now for this session. Session 5 really follows and builds on the previous session, focusing squarely on the issue of low carbon and inclusive industrial development. As we move to a green economy, an inclusive green economy in South Africa and beyond, we know that industrial development has to be at the core of that transition. A meaningful transition is economy-wide and society-wide. And in that respect, industrial development and industrial policy need to drive that change. We're very fortunate to have three excellent speakers and presentation today for this session. A variety of context from a more regional, in terms of sub-national context, through the Atlantis Special Economic Zone, and then to discussions at the regional SADC level as well as the African level. So really, we're going to tackle the issue from a number of angles, both from the subnational to the regional to the continental level. The format will be the same as for the previous session. We're going to have three presentations of 15 minutes each. You are welcome to ask your questions using the Q&A function in the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we'll also allow for live questions that you are welcome to ask again in the Q&A function or in the chat box as well. But without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, which is Matt Cullinan. Matt is an infrastructure executive at the Atlantis Greentech Special Economic Zone, which has been recently established in 2019. And he was going to tell us about the specificity, really, of the Atlantis SEZ, particularly as it pertains to the move to a green industrialized pathway for South Africa. Matt, the floor is yours. You got 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gaylor. Thanks. Good morning, everybody, and thanks to TIPS for this opportunity. Can you all see my screen? Is it coming through?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. So this paper really explores the pathway to resilient, low carbon and socially inclusive industrialization, and in particular, the role of the Atlantis Greentech SEZ in that. So a lot of the ideas here are quite exploratory. It's looking at how we can use this Atlantis Greentech SEZ to really contribute positively to South Africa's green industrialization, if you like. The paper was co-authored by Ursula Wellman, who leads on the sort of skills, enterprise, and community development side of things at the Atlantis SEZ, but she's on maternity leave, so I'm doing the presentation today. The presentation's not going to cover everything in the paper. I just really want to focus on two key areas that we think are quite interesting in the context of the SEZ. The first is that if we're serious about transitioning to a just, inclusive, low carbon, resource efficient future, then we need to push our industrialization process and efforts in that direction. And the Atlantis SEZ, or SEZs generally, but certainly in the case of Atlantis, is a publicly funded living lab, if you like, where there is an opportunity to explore how this can be done and then to share lessons around it. So it's that side of the kind of industrial policy experiment that is something that we want to explore. And then secondly, and linked to the first point, is that SEZ as a policy tool for industrialization are controversial. They often fail, they're often misused, seen as a waste of funds and money. But I think the argument we make is that in this instance, it is actually the right tool, but that its success is not necessarily going to be based on incentives. And it rather, one needs to adopt a more nuanced and responsive role to meeting investor needs. And that can be done using tools that are mostly under the control of an SEZ company or its shareholders, in this case, provincial and local government. But just in light of what some of the stuff that was raised in the previous session, there's no doubt that policy certainty and that whole connection to regional industrial value chains and also policy is a critical support component to the success, certainly of the Atlantis SEZ. Let me just go quickly. So just to contextualize quickly, the Atlantis SEZ is based in the municipality of Cape Town in South Africa. Sorry about that. About 50 kilometers north of the Cape Town CBD. And just by context, I think the Dube trade port is about 30 kilometers north of the Durban CBD. It's been around since the early 70s. It was originally established as a, if you like, colored homeland. And it was designed to house 500,000 people. But today the population is around 70 to 80,000 people. And it never really reached its anticipated size, largely due to resistance to removals and relocation to the area. But it does and did have a large industrial area that was developed. And during the 80s and late 70s and mid 80s, it grew quite big through a lot of industrial incentives, defense manufacturing contracts and so forth. But really then towards the mid 90s, late 80s, mid 90s, all those incentives fell away and the area went into quite steep decline, with a lot of subsequent loss of jobs, increasing unemployment and poverty in the area. In 2011, the city of Cape Town then started looking at how it could revitalize the area, working together with the Western Cape government and National DTI, began exploring different ways to incentivize development in the area. It developed what it called a green manufacturing hub, and that was also partly in response to the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, where it was seen if you're rolling out sort of wind and energy, there would be a need for a manufacturing capability to support that, and so a dedicated zone. So the city of Cape Town and its partners, and with the provincial government and National DTI, began putting in place a range of programs to support development. That all culminated in around 2015, where a decision was taken to apply for SEZ status, and that was finally granted in 2018. And in a sense, the SEZ still actually hasn't been fully, in a sense, set up. The land has recently been transferred to the SEZ from the city of Cape Town, or the decision taken, and we're still awaiting our 3D status application. It's also quite a strange zone in the sense that it's made up of different portions or parts of land within the Atlantis industrial area. So the dark orange are the vacant pieces of land that will be transferred to the SEZ from the city of Cape Town. And the light orange areas are privately owned pieces of land that are already developed, that are are companies and manufacturing activities that meet the green tech criteria that were established to guide which investors would be enabled to invest in the zone. So the Atlantis is a green tech zone, and I think there's obviously many ways one can define green tech, but for the purposes of the Atlantis SEZ, the lens that is applied in looking at an investor is just to see whether they meet three broad principles, which is that it results in lower carbon, and ultimately the goal being obviously carbon neutral or zero carbon, improved resource efficiency, and is also socially inclusive. So that's really about mitigating or reversing the impact of human activity on the environment. And it relates to many of the things that one would expect around green manufacturing, energy storage, energy efficiency, water efficiency, improved waste management, and also resource efficient production processes. So that's really just my quick way of background. Coming then to the question of special economic zones, one can sort of see two views of SEZs, particularly in South Africa. The one is a sort of just an economic zone with incentives, and the other is more a zone which seeks to actively experiment with and explore industrial policy approaches and responses, which would perhaps not be acceptable or considered too risky or too dispersed to apply across the board in a country. So I think in both cases, the goal would remain to support SA's industrialization and industrial policies. But I would argue that in South Africa, we've typically tended to follow the first view, which is you define a zone and you get your incentives, and then you just try and get as many new industries attracted there to sort of support broader industrialization and job creation. But I think the view expressed here is that with the Atlantis SEZ, the ideal is to adopt the second approach, which is to push the boundaries of policies as regards green industrialization. And we'll explore that a little bit more in terms of how we see it. But there's also growing evidence that that's really what China did when it started its SEZ policy, is that there were policy experiments. There were an attempt to see how a more, if you like, capitalist or free market approach to its industrial processes would work. And they were done so in a contained space. And there's an opportunity here to do so with the Atlantis SEZ. So as policy experiments, what does that mean? I think the question is, if you're gonna design a zone, first of all, you need to decide what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and from an industrialization perspective, and is an SEZ the right tool? If it is the right tool, then you're making quite a big commitment in terms of certainly taxpayers' money and capital investment potentially. So if you're going to do it, then the idea is go big or radical with the experiment. And the word radical here is not to suggest something a bit crazy or not thought through, but something that really pushes the boundaries, that tests an idea or a particular way or approach to industrialization, and then make it special. What is it that you're trying to do? Which investors are you trying to attract, and what are you doing that will attract those particular investors? So research also shows that SEZs and industrial policy, that aside from making a zone special, the success of on getting the fundamentals right, and research by people like Tom Farrell and the World Bank and others has shown that you've got to get those basics right, and that's partly an issue of location, and zones that have been successful generally are closer to ports. The role of governance or the role of the entity almost as an intermediary between government and the private sector, playing an investment facilitation and supporting that intersectoral collaboration is very important. and then obviously the quality of the infrastructure and the services provided. And certainly industries surveyed in zones all show that as amongst their most important criteria, including things like labor, stability and skills and things like that. Then also the impact of a zone is certainly enhanced through the spillovers. The direct jobs created through investors coming into a zone is generally much less than the indirect jobs created through the connections to the regional value chains, through other enterprises, inputs, and so forth. So by actively looking at how that integration and how those spillovers can be maximized and enhanced is also a way to increase the impact of your SEZ. As mentioned, the sort of enabling and stable policy environment is essential. And we'll talk a bit more than that, about that. But certainly the points made by Glenn in the previous session really align very closely to our experience in the Atlantis SEZ. And of course, expecting investment incentives to do the trick on their own is just completely the wrong way to approach it. And in fact, may even not be necessary in the context of some of these other factors. So for us then, being special, the Atlantis Greentech SEZ is about exploring this trajectory towards a low carbon and resource efficient future whilst growing social inclusion, and also benefiting from that growing domestic and global market in green tech. And then really actively experimenting with zero carbon, resource efficient and socially inclusive industrialization processes. So really exploring what it is to go green and to chart this pathway towards a green economy. Just quickly then, Gaylor, I hope you'll just let me know when I'm reaching the end of my time. But the first example then that I just want to discuss is around this policy certainty story and Gestamp Renewable Energies, which is one of the investors that's come into the SEZ. So we already have existing and brought in new investors prior to designation, and certainly prior to any SEZ incentives or funding being available to the Atlantis SEZ. So that's quite a lot of money that's come in, around 600 million in various ways, 350 to 400 jobs. And GRI is a wind tower manufacturer, and through GRI also came Resolux, which deals with wind turbine internals, and Quantum V3, which is the gases required to support wind tower manufacture. As mentioned, the Atlantis manufacturing hub was set up by the City of Cape Town in response to the REAP and to attract manufacturers in a cluster. And of course, there are the other advantages of Atlantis and the history of industrial skills, which actually match quite nicely with those required. Gestamp came in on the back of the REAP. They made their investment in 2014-15. As mentioned, initial investment of 300 million, followed by a further 175 million, 250 to 300 jobs. The project itself won awards and accolades from UNCTAD for the speed with which it got going, a record 11 months. So the rapid turnaround included streamlining of the land transaction process, approval of the building plans, some of the preemptive work, including environmental authorizations, the fact that there was existing bulk infrastructure, skills, and road access, and then the City of Cape Town development contribution and electricity incentives. But there were no SEZ incentives, and then subsequently these other firms were also attracted. If we look at then, 1 minute, thanks. If we look at then the incentives, there's a whole bunch of incentives which are available, but it was really the City of Cape Town ones that applied here, and then a national 12I tax allowance, which is an accelerated building depreciation, which in fact has since been discontinued. So we also, on the proactive side, there's the new emergency power procurement program, which has been announced by the Department of Energy. And again, there's been a process of rezoning the entire Site 3 there. Not rezoning, sorry, getting an environmental authorization for a gas to power construction on that site. So we hope to take advantage of that. And again, that's a policy initiative rather than specific incentives. Quickly, that we have the Living Lab, which is, we have these green tech principles of lower carbon, resource efficiency, and social inclusion. And those guide which investors can come in. But we also want to use those concepts as the way that we run and manage the park. So the way we deal with our waste, our energy, and our water, for example. And we see that as quite a purposeful approach. It's an opportunity to showcase green tech industrial processes. And it's living examples of what can be done, tried and tested, and then shared. And we see that as having benefits for investors in terms of reduced service costs and possibly green production certification. We're in discussions with UNIDO around their eco-industrial parks, and the DTI is also involved in that process. And then for the community with the focus on inclusion and also skills and enterprise development programs. I think then I'll just wrap up there, Gaylor, but I think the main point then is that the policy certainty is critical. The sort of fiscal incentives are less so. And the focus is on enabling investors, strong business support and facilitation, and providing reliable, affordable, and high quality infrastructure and services. The focus on the spillovers and really the idea of this living lab as an experiment to try these things out using, in a sense, public funds, and then sharing that and seeing what can be replicated across the board in terms of the transition to a green economy. So thanks.
Matt, for a very thought-provoking presentation, I think, in terms of how we use and can use SEZs to experiment in the country for green economy, but I guess for many other things as well. I would remind you to please ask your questions using the Q&A or the chat box. You can start putting them through, and then we'll attend to them after the presentations. We now jump from some sub-regional focus to a regional focus with a SADC perspective. Our next speaker is Rex Asiama. He's a research assistant and PhD candidate at the DSI NRF SARCHI Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg. And he's going to look at the link really between high technology exports, industrial development, growth, but also energy specifically. Rex, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. This morning present a work in progress that a good friend of mine, Dr. I hope you can see the screen though. So I'm happy to present this. Good friend of mine, Dr. Avenyo, is assisting me here. And I also want to thank Prof. Tregina for the encouragement to submit this and to present. So as you mentioned earlier on, the story that we are trying to tell connects technology exports, electricity, and industrial development in African. I'll go through this outline, as we go on. So just to keep everyone abreast of what is going on. So we start from a premise of basically current times that we are in now, and the fact that if there's any need to industrialize, maybe it is actually now, because African countries have gone back to a position which they were trying to get out of, in the 80s, 90s, burdened by debts and, trying to recover. their economies. There has been very little structural change despite growth. And the point is, okay, maybe we should now think about restructuring the economies so that we can catch up, and achieve the type of growth that really brings the developments we are looking at in Africa. So this paper actually connects two sections of the academic literature, more the export-led growth and industrialization literature, later on the literature on electricity. And broadly, the export-led growth literature just says that, okay, if you are exporting manufacturers, then you should see a positive influence of growth because technology exports, improve productivity and add a lot more value. If you are doing technology export at a certain level, low tech exports maybe not so much. So those ones should be discarded. Of course, some scholars have argued that, okay, African countries may not be ready for that, should focus on what they call comparative advantage. But the counter argument to that is no one has a comparative advantage in technology. And countries gain competitive advantage over time through learning by doing, practicing, and eventually they get the hang of it. The story of one of the earlier speakers who told a story about the glass production in Taiwan. They learned how to do it over time and eventually got better and substituted their imports of glass from Japan with their own production in Taiwan. So it is possible to do if it is learned well. But we realized that a key challenge to export-led growth in African countries and building the capacity is electricity production. That itself is fundamental to ensuring that companies have that resource they need to work and produce goods for export.
Rex,
so,
can I please ask you to just try and speak into the mic because we're losing you a bit at times.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So going on, electricity supply challenges and power outages have persisted in the SADC region also, and I don't think that is news here. Earlier speakers have mentioned that as well. And this picture basically tries to show kind of give an idea of the transmission capacity across Africa. If you look down south, in the Southern African area, you see, the blue dots represent the generational capacity. And basically, to summarize the research problem, what we are saying is you cannot have this situation here on the right in order to ensure that what happens on the left here is sustainable. So then there's a conflict that is going on between these two cases. So we try to answer this research question using an empirical approach and an econometric one. And we believe that what we are doing contributes to the literature on the determinants of industrialization, as well as others who have looked at electricity access in Africa. We pick secondary data from a number of sources, UNIDO, World Development Indicators, African Development Indicators, and a few others. And we follow an econometric model by Haraguchi, who tries to discuss the factors of industrialization in countries across the world. We use a sample period 1990 to 2016 based on data availability for 22 African countries. In order to capture really what we feel is a measure of industrialization and growth, we use the MVA per capita and included the medium and high-tech export variables and low-tech variables, and also did some kind of interaction between the two because we understand that, electricity itself is a resource for export production. So then they will depend on each other, for successful output. By working on the other issues, other econometric issues, we end up with the FGLS technique, after controlling for some of the other econometric issues that we found. This is by way of descriptive. You would expect that electricity, if there's stable and consistent supply of electricity manufacturing output would increase over time. So these are just descriptives that show the positive relationship. And we found the inverse in the case of low-tech exports because of their ability to decrease productivity over time. These are some of the results, but I will not. We've summarized the results there, so I'll just speak to that. So generally, what we find is that there is a consistent story. Medium and high-tech exports and electricity production are important for industrial development and growth. We also find a net positive effect on MVA per capita in African countries. So the point here is that across Africa, if the electricity supply worsens and tech exports reduce, industrial development will slow down and vice versa. We also do some regional level analysis for West Africa and Southern Africa. And particularly in Southern Africa, we find that electricity production has had an influence on our measure of industrialization here. And that suggests that lower electricity supply affects industrial development. But we don't find any evidence of an effect from medium and high-tech exports in the Southern African region. We do find a negative influence of low-tech exports on our measure of industrial development in the Southern African region. On the other hand, our control variables included fixed capital formation, mineral rents, capital account openness, private sector credit, and population growth. And these showed a significant influence on industrial development in the Southern African case. And we saw some consistency between earlier estimations, fixed effects, and the FGLS, but that's a bit too technical. So what does all of this mean for policy? And I think that's the most important point of this discussion. You should expect to find an improvement in productivity if you go along the path with technology exports in the manufacturing sector generally. But fundamentally, that can't happen if you still have rolling blackouts and industries don't have power at a certain point. Their outputs will be adversely affected. So in terms of policy, the suggestion is that the power shouldn't go off for the industries at all. There should be a negotiation around that. I mentioned that again. On the other hand, low-tech exports are not the way to go because of the productivity issue I mentioned earlier. But we also identify some structural transformation issues because if we control for other things like capital account openness and private sector credit, we think that those variables kind of support this whole idea, supports the structural transformation towards services through trade and financial liberalization that has been introduced or that is going on currently in African countries, especially in the Southern African countries, because you see a lot more of these financial services from Southern Africa who are expanding into other regions, finance and insurance companies who are expanding into other regions, and very little of those other tech companies. So we're not saying that this is bad. I mean, trade is definitely good, but it needs to be balanced with the priorities of domestic industrial policy. Again, public-private partnerships could work, especially in Southern Africa, because the share of private sector credits in GDP is high. But the role of the state is important here. So the private sector can't do it alone without state support. And that part is equally important to industrial development and catch up. Furthermore, we think that industrial policy in Southern Africa must focus on a structural transformation agenda that is centered on industry and manufacturing, and maybe not so much on the services. And by doing so, especially for the power agreements, industrial policy can be used to create a special power agreements for the manufacturing sector, implemented through industrial parks, hubs, or special economic zones. Earlier on, some people had mentioned protectionism, etc. We're not necessarily referring so much to protectionism here, but you also want to make sure that you have domestic production capacity within. so that you're not losing out entirely through imports. But there is a political economy question surrounding the power sector, and that isn't just in Southern Africa. I think that's more an African problem. But you cannot allow the political economy issues to supersede industrial policy. So these issues largely relate to the political economy issues in the power sector, largely relates to decisions on who pays more or less for power and how supply is affected, etc., etc. But going back to the first point, if there is a special power agreement for the domestic manufacturing sector, then the government is assured that there is domestic production capacity that won't be affected, so that they find other ways of dealing with the supply problems. And lastly, industrial policy can also consider redirecting the efforts of labor-saving technology used in producing high-tech exports towards medium technology activities that can sustain the momentum towards industrial development. This point is largely about labor displacement, because in the deindustrialization literature, it's obvious that there's been a reduction in manufacturing share of total employment. When that happens, of course, there are more firms that are using technology, but the labor that is displaced needs to be absorbed in other sectors. And this is where the industrial policy can come in. So if the point is just to say that there actually needs to be a holistic overview of the policy on labor placement and displacement once technology is being adopted and the country is aiming at high-tech exports. Okay, so I think that about does it for my presentation here. Thank you very much.
He is the regional integration and trade expert at the Institute of International Relations in Cameroon. And we are very excited to have him to really talk to us about the role of regional integration in trying to promote an inclusive development on the African continent. I think we put a lot of emphasis on regional integration and how it can or cannot contribute to an inclusive green economy going forward. So very much looking forward to hearing Mokom on that topic. Mokom, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Firstly, I want to thank the TIPS team for giving me this opportunity to present my paper on regional integration and industrialization. Firstly, it will be important for us to understand what regional integration is all about. So we know that regional integration stems from the theory of regionalism in international relations. Regionalism in Africa dates back in 1884 during the Scramble of Africa. That's after the Berlin Conference, and it was perceived in 1960 to be a political project meant to deepen regional cooperation, social cohesion, and integration among African states. Gaylor, it's worth noting that Africa has evolved, but the regional integration agenda was more shaped during 1960, during the formation of the African Union by the Monrovia and the Casablanca blocs. The concept was later perceived to be an economic-driven initiative centered on the economic growth and development of the African continent. And that's why today we talk about the African Economic Community. The building blocks of the African regional integration agenda, we have some treaties and agreements which head of states and government of the continent have committed themselves over the years. We have the Lagos Plan of Action, we have the Abuja Treaty of 1991, and presently we have Agenda 2063. We know that this agenda is for the structural transformation of the continent, and regional integration has triggered inclusive growth, and intra-African trade is key to economic diversification and sustainable development. Here we can note also that the AFCFTA is a regional trade agreement, and presently there exist 203 regional trade agreements in force and correspond to 490 notifications from its members. The AFCFTA is an agreement which has as main objectives to boost intra-African trade. And it is hoping that this agreement is going to pave the way for the implementation of the industrialization flagship programs. The African industrialization agenda was first experienced in the 1960s, and it was conceived as an import substitution policy. But this policy failed because of its limits and the global political economy at that time. And we know today that Africa still relies a lot on the agricultural sector, but the African continental free trade area could be Africa's new strength. Africa is home to 5 of the most fastest growing economies in the world, but this growth is unsustainable and non-inclusive since it is mostly driven by the export of unprocessed commodities with little value addition. With a population of about 1.2 billion, Africa's GDP stands at $2.58 trillion with a growth rate of 3.7%. The continent is least interconnected infrastructure-wise, has the least intra-regional banking, and trades the least with itself. It's also worthy to note that Africa's regional integration is concentrated on trade integration, regional infrastructure, productive integration, free movement of people, and financial and macroeconomic integration. The service sector trade is still low, and intra-Africa service trade is lower. Only 2% of world services export originate from Africa. We note also that according to the Economic Commission for Africa, trade has been stagnant since 1980 to 2013, from 12% to 11%, where it has remained. That's for the past years. It hasn't changed. The manufacturing value added for export far lags behind the rest of the world, even among developing countries. In 2017, sub-Saharan Africa's manufacturing value added was only about $145 billion. Future development through the various projects of the AU gives hope for sustainable growth as envisaged by UN Sustainable Development Goal 9 for infrastructure, industrialization, and innovation. So the Africa's regional integration and industrialization agenda has been greatly supported by the flagship programs of the African Union, Agenda 2063. So to name a few, we have the Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, that's IDA. We have PIDA, Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. We have the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, and we have the Single African Air Transport Market, creating a single market for air transport in Africa. Here we have a list of the various flagship programs of of Agenda 2063, and it is good to mention here that these flagship programs are intertwined and were conceived for the structural transformation of the continent. Talking about intra-African trade, in 2019, South Africa exported more to certain countries such as China, Germany, and the USA. At the continental level, South Africa traded more with some SADC countries like Botswana, Mozambique, and Namibia. According to the HS code, the various goods that were mostly exported include natural or cultured pills, precious or semi-precious stones, precious metals, slag, and ash, and vehicles other than railway or tramway. More than 50% of intra-Africa trade is done between the SADC regional community members, and more than half in SACO, that's the Customs Union. Looking at the chart, that's a list of importing markets for a product exported by South Africa. We know that China tops the chart with products that were exported from South Africa to China between 8 million to 10,000, that's to 10 million US dollars. Likewise, we have Germany with products that were exported between 6 million to 8 million US dollars, and we have the United States with products that were exported also as between about 4 million to 6 million US dollars. On this chart, it is noticeable that there is no African country that figures here. So we are hoping that with the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, there's the intra-Africa trade that will be boosted. We note here too that the middle class in Africa is expected to reach about 210 million in 2020 and rise to 490 million by 2040. This is a market worth about $250 billion, and it is set to grow at an annual rate of 5% by 2025. The growing private sector in Africa, comprising innovators, producers, and employers, presents the greatest opportunity to alleviate poverty and unemployment. Intra-African trade is expected to increase by 52.3% compared to a baseline scenario without the African continental free trade area. But this scenario could be hindered by the health pandemic caused by the COVID-19. So we're hoping that that's with the shift as the African continental free trade area day has been rescheduled for 2021, maybe the scenario could be different. Despite the putting in place of the various structural projects for Africa, we know that certain industries are still reluctant to invest on the continent. But here we have many conditions, enabling conditions that's to present to them so that they can be much more motivated. That's to invest on the continent. If the foreign that's conditions include favorable demographics, we have growing internal markets, we have urbanization and technological development. It is also envisaged that Africa will have about 2 billion people in 2050, which is over 1/5 of the projected global population, the largest and youngest workforce by 2025, and over 500 million people in the labor market. By 2050 also, we know that 56% of the population of Africa will be urban, and Africa's 20 biggest cities are expected to grow by 50% in a decade. The African Union and its institutions, the African Development Bank, have been supporting a lot of cross-border infrastructural projects. And we hope that these cross-border infrastructure projects are going to link the various industrial cities across the continent, because there are so many regional and value chains that are going to be created with the implementation of the African continental free trade area. In addition, also, Africa is a hub for human resources and other resources. We have chrome, we have platinum, we have uranium, nickel, we have trade oil, we have cocoa production, palm produce, just to name a few. Despite the putting in place of the industrialization agenda by the AU, we have so many challenges stemming from the crisis of varied nature, which have retarded the regional integration and industrialization drive. We have rapid population growth, youth unemployment, conflict and internal strife, and growing inequality. We have threats such as weak institutions, state fragility, exclusion and poor management of diversity, terrorism, transnational crime, corruption, and lack of accountability. Africa also is a hub of raw materials, but these materials are illicitly exploited. The persistent crises and pandemics in the continent always prompts African states also to call for debt relief measures from international financial institutions, which are at times detrimental to the development and growth of the continent. We know that due to the COVID-19, the AFCFTA July 1st, 2020 deadline to commence trading among nations has been rescheduled, and IMF has predicted that sub-Saharan Africa is likely to experience a recession in 2020, with the GDP expected to contract between 2.1 and 5.1%. Africa also is plagued with the problem of obsolete trade agreements which do not match with the present trends. And also there's a problem of egoistic interests of states and lack of political will to incorporate the AU industrialization agenda into the national plan, and it considerably obstructs the industrial cooperation and integration of the continent. However, these challenges are there, but we have selected some possible solutions that could help cut these challenges. We know that a robust manufacturing sector is a fundamental part to economic growth and development. The AFCFTA agreement that will boost intra-African trade, reinforce multilateralism through the connection of the industrialization plans of member states and regional economic communities, and foster the creation of new value chains. Simple, transparent, business-friendly, and predictable rules of origin could be a game changer for the continent. The preferential trade liberalization that the AFCFTA would facilitate industrialization. enhancing Africa's industrial capacity through value chains and flexible intellectual property rights, boosting the integrated African digital economy through improved internet penetration. Cooperation among Africa's development financial institutions is also crucial for industrialization of the continent. Trade finance is essential to achieve trade development. Flexible concessional loans by AU financial institutions to member states, improve multilateralism to boost wider trading platform for industries and their goods. African countries need to also benchmark other countries such as Ethiopia, Rwanda, and South Africa. These countries have set the pace for industrialization, and it is pretty like that's working on well. So we are thinking that if other countries could maybe like copy this, emulate this example, the continent is going to achieve the envisaged goal for structural transformation. The creation of special economic zones, specialized industrial clusters, and industrial parks will spur economic growth and guarantee social integration and preserve the environment. Financing infrastructure development in the continent will also boost the services sector, which is a strong factor for industrial development. The new industrialization model must be closer to the commodities production centers, looking at the leapfrogging technological potential and with African growth markets in mind. Environmental sustainability will enhance sustainable consumption and production in Africa. Bilateral and multilateral agreements between African states and foreign states should also be reviewed. Africa's industrialization should be bottom up and not top down. We encourage South-South cooperation, and climate-smart agriculture can boost the agricultural productivity of the continent and help in responding to the issues of climate change. Coming into the industrialization club at a time when many accords and agreements on climate change have been taken, such as Paris Accord on climate change, Africa has the advantage and possibility to industrialize differently and set the pace for the second industrial revolution. To conclude, we note that with the implementation of the AFCFTA, there is hope that Africa's industrialization era is now. The opportunities that this agreement holds are enormous, from tariff liberalization, the raising market of 1.2 billion people, the removal of non-tariff barriers, and creation of regional and global value chains. The AFCFTA is regarded as part of the post-COVID-19 medium-term recovery effort for the continent. However, this is the time for Africa to seize the opportunity to pursue the Made in Africa industrialization revolution. Also, we can conclude that industrialization in Africa should be a resource-based industrialization through the transformation of the abundant special resources, which will lead to value addition on goods and services. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mokom, for this presentation. Lots of things to think about as well in terms of the role of regional integration and what it needs to achieve and how we achieve it. To start our discussion and Q&A, I actually want to throw a question that I think is relevant for all of you, all the speakers. A question from the chat from Eugene, which really puts things into perspective. So Eugene asks, how do we reconcile, if you want, the concept of zero carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive with the situation in South Africa, but also in other countries actually in the region, which are very mineral intensive, and the way to move in terms of industrial development would be to support the beneficiation of our mineral resources, which we know is very energy intensive and at times carbon intensive. So how do we kind of reconcile those two or three dimensions even of, if you want, carbon and resource efficient, socially inclusive, and our endowment in natural and mineral resources particularly. So I think it's relevant for all of you. Matt, do you want to start on that one maybe?
Okay. It's a very difficult question, and I'll have a shot at it. But I mean, I guess my and I don't think this is necessarily an answer, but it's kind of saying, well, how could one approach something like that? And my gut feeling would be that one would want to break that down into, well, if we look at mining, and obviously there are many forms of mining, from sort of deep underground shafts, which require quite a lot of energy just for air circulation and lifts and stuff like that, to open cast mining, which is then quite heavy equipment and vehicles, and so sort of air emissions from that perspective from vehicles. But one could then say, there's opportunities in what kind of vehicles you use, moving to potentially electric vehicles, or possibly gas or hydrogen powered vehicles, or to renewable energy for your air conditioning systems and deep shafts and so forth. So that is one. And as I said, this is more, I suppose it's just taking a shot at things that one could consider. In terms of resource efficient, again, I think there's many opportunities to be much more effective with the way one utilizes the actual mined resources and the wastage and the remining and reworking. But it is, by its nature, mining is extractive and not renewable, even if the products can be recycled. And socially inclusive, I think that there are many models around providing opportunities for the workers themselves to have a greater stake in what comes out. And if not that kind of approach, then certainly much better support networks and safety nets and associated support for families to be with the miners and so forth. So I don't think that's an answer necessarily, but it would have to include some of those things, I guess.
Thanks. No, I think, look, yeah, I'm not expecting us to answer everything today, but I think some thoughts are important. Rex, do you have any thought on that particular question?
Yeah, Gaylor, I do. Well, you see, the thing is, earlier presentations had focused on the connection between technology and carbon emissions. And so I think that from an empirical standpoint, we can make the argument that if there's more technology and it's good enough and reliable enough, we should see less carbon emissions. Now the other thing is, look, we're in a pandemic and most people are working from home, but in several other parts, people report that the rivers that used to be dirty and choked, they've all cleared up and they're green now. So that just tells me that there is some kind of association between an increased reliance on technology for our economic activities and the workings of the economy and reducing carbon emissions. Those are not mutually independent of each other, and in some ways, I believe that they are also connected. The system to balance those two, I don't have an answer to that for now, but I do think that as African countries strive to develop towards becoming more resilient and increasing their productive capacity, they can't do that without technology. So the more reliance on technology should get us to a point where we have some of these carbon emissions reducing, because I believe that is what the developed countries are doing. So they spend a lot of money on research and development to come up with new technologies that can make the environment better. I'm not an environmental economist, so I can't speak to the details of some of those things. But generally, I do agree that it's important that these two problems be solved at the same time. And I would suppose that the easier way to go is just to ensure that people adapt to technology and use it, so that they don't, so that the environment doesn't suffer. In that direction, we're able to prevent the human attitudes and the abuse that contributes to all these other environmental problems. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rex. Mokom, you also speak a lot about this link between inclusivity and our natural resources. Any insight on the interaction between those three dimensions that you can bring?
Hello. I think it's really imperative for all African countries, especially with regards to their industrialization policy. So that's to include the policy of carbon emission, and that's to help curb some pollution and other effects that could be detrimental to the well-being of the citizens. But however, technology is an important factor also for industrial development, and the inclusive nature of as developmental projects, developmental programs entails that that's the two sectors should move together. But now there is another opinion that thinks that really if industries have to that's for industrialization to be effective, technology has also to be that's to be well managed. But to me, I think really that technological development is important for industrialization. And Africa, as of now, is still heading towards industrialization. And I'm hoping that the various member states of the African Union are going to put in place mechanisms and policies in that light. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And next question I want to direct to Matt specifically. There's a few questions about the SEZ that have been raised in the Q&A. Some are very specific, so maybe Matt, you can just answer to those directly in the Q&A. But one that I think is very important is the question from Glenn, about the link between SEZ and their broader environment. So Glenn said, since so many SEZ seems to operate as island of privilege with weak connections into the local economy, other than some employment, how can we maybe deepen local firm supply linkages? And obviously in the case of Atlantis, but probably relevant to all SEZs.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there's no doubt that it is probably the biggest challenge, particularly for the Atlantis SEZ, given where it's located. If we look at the immediate surrounding community of Atlantis and Mamre and Pella and so forth. However, it is in fact one of the areas that is given the most attention by the SEZ, and I'm sorry that Ursula is not able to be involved, because, as I said, she's driving the skills and enterprise development programs. And these are very, very active ongoing programs that we have in Atlantis, specifically targeting the skills associated with the green economy. And as investors come on board, the opportunity to develop backward and even forward linkages with the enterprises in the SEZ. It's still early days, so we can't sort of point to any specific opportunities. So some of the obvious ones are sort of kind of not necessarily that glamorous or specifically linked to the green economy, like your cleaning and security and other contracts. But certainly on the skills training side, there's quite a lot of emphasis on training for the green economy. So like the installation of rooftop solar and the maintenance of solar, those kind of opportunities. So there would be opportunities that are not just necessarily applicable to the SEZ, but to the broader green economy. And I think on that score, the SEZ itself is coordinating the activities of other spheres of government and working with quite a lot of other colleges to coordinate those kinds of programs. So those spillover benefits, if you like. But it is a particularly difficult one to get right. But the difficulty of it, I think, is also part of the learnings. And you know, so we are trying different ways and different things to see what will work. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, no, it's obviously at the crux of some of the questions. Next, I'd like to invite Farai to ask a question. There's a very interesting question directed to Rex in the Q&A. So could we allow Farai to ask a question? Again, perfect.
Okay. You may not be able to see my picture, but I think you can hear what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you know, this whole industrialization strategy, if you like, that we are looking at in Southern Africa. Maybe we need to look at initiatives such as when we talk about you know, environmentally friendly technologies, such as adoption of solar, for example, adoption of wind technologies, adoption of, you know, all these technologies that are considered to be green. I'm saying, should we not actually be using that as a means to actually quicken industrialization in the region? In other words, I'm saying, let's take advantage of our desire to adopt these technologies by developing industries that tie in with that desire, rather than for us to be promoting industrialization of other countries like China. For example, if you look at solar technologies, we are importing the technologies from China. Why are we not using that as a stepping stone for us to actually develop those technologies for producing solar panels, for example? Whilst on the one hand, we are contributing to greening our region, at the same time, we are actually developing the industrial capacity that in the end will benefit us more than you know, more than one way. In other words, we are benefiting from industrialization whilst we are benefiting from greening ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Farai. Rex, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the panelists for the question. So from what it is he said, I think his concern is around the value that renewable energy resources brings to the industrialization argument. And I think it's a welcome suggestion. You know, I don't have the specific details on how the policymakers choose to adapt to some of these things. But yeah, technology can be learned and adapted. There really isn't any other rule around that. Many of the countries who are developed now, who understand, they use their technology because they took the time to learn it. So his suggestion is actually quite good, that yeah, if you have renewable resources, why not just use that to support industry? But remember that some of my points had earlier indicated that there is a political economy itself around power distribution and power production and power supply in different regions in Africa. And depending on the region, I believe that the way it works may be different. So what that would mean is that if renewable energy suppliers are coming into a market that is already dominated by suppliers of energy energy from coal or oil and all of those things, it has its own set of dynamics, and I think that policymakers have to decide on what is important and how they handle some of those things. Yes, we have the benefits. In certain parts of Africa, there are benefits of the sun. People can use solar. There are other ones like wind. One of the presenters mentioned some of these things. These are all good to use. It's renewable, so it can be used and it is sustainable. If we don't get to a point where we have actually encouraged people to adopt some of these renewable technologies, I'm afraid that there still will be a bit of a struggle, because now, as it is, those who sell oil, those who supply oil to power energy plants, they are the ones who seem to be calling the shots. And even after the pandemic, after the drop in the oil price, it's gone back up again. So that should tell you that there is some amount of power that these oil producers bring to the fore. And if we want to reduce the reliance, yes, we can go in the renewable energy department, but that also comes with its own challenges. So it's not bad to consider, but I think it needs some more consideration just to get to a point where it's sustainable for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex, for this insight. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for this session, and we can't get to all the other questions today. But all the presentations will be made available, including the details of all the presenters. You're welcome to engage with them directly.